Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Or can everybody hear me? Can I have a yay or nay?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Right, what I'm going to be presenting today is the rise in authoritarianism. Okay, so we're going to be looking deeper into that, why it's taking place, and we're going to go through it together and what's happening in our world today. So the rise in authoritarianism. So the actual word authoritarianism is a political system characterized by the injection of political plurality. Okay, the use of strong central power to preserve the political status quo, and reductions in the rule of law, separation of powers, and democratic voting. So the enforcement of or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. That's another understanding of it. Can somebody read what's on the screen for me, please? What we're going to be doing this morning is going through how democracy started in the centuries past, the early centuries, and we're going to get an understanding of how they thought democracy was, and then we're going to go into how democracy is going to be used in our century today. So can somebody please read what's on the screen? Curtis, are you able to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So the question is asked, how many people hold power in a society and how they exercise it are external themes of political debate. In the past world, a single person ruled. This system is usually called a monarchy, meaning rule by one in Greek, when inherited within a family. It is likely to be given such names as tyranny, from examples in Greek history, or dictatorship, from Rome, when power is seized by or granted to an individual of society. The other extreme is democracy, Greek for power of the people, in which theoretically every adult can influence group decisions. Such an egalitarian approach is familiar to anthropologists, studying the customs of small tribal groups, but it has been a rarity in more developed societies. Between the two extremes is oligarchy, Greek for rule by a few. In a sense, all early clashes between oligarchy and democracy are an argument over how many to include in the few, with the Democrats pressing for a higher figure than oligarchs can accept. Even in Athens, where sophisticated democracy begins, only a small portion of the community can vote.
Thank you very much. What do you get from that, Curtis?
The purpose is just to distinguish between the three forms of government that historically, at least, have existed, being a monarchy where it's one individual leading from the top down, and it's passed on. That rule of power is passed down through lineage in a family. That is compared to a democracy where it's not so much a family passing down, but the decisions are made by the collective, by at least as they put it, adults in society. And then the third is oligarchy, which they say sits in between the two, but instead of ruling by the many, it's ruled by a small group of people within that society. And then questions arise, okay, who should be included in that few group?
Okay, thank you very much, Curtis, for that. We're going to go on to our next slide. And so we're going to look into Athenian democracy in the 5th century. And I put some bullet points up there, which I'm going to expand on. So we're going to be looking at 5th century BC Athens pioneers. Democracy of this kind has two preconditions: The citizens, democrats of Athens are those males over the age of 18, and democracy is achieved in several stages. So we're going to start with the first bullet point. So the 5th century BC Athens pioneers experiment in direct democracy as opposed to the representative democracy of modern societies. It is copied by her Greek allies and colonies at the time, but it has rarely been attempted anywhere else since Switzerland in the 13th century. Second bullet point, democracy of this kind has two preconditions. The community must be small enough for citizens to be able to attend debates and voting on issues, and its economy must give these citizens enough leisure to engage in politics. In the ancient world, this means that there must be slaves to do most of the work. Both circumstances prevail in Athens. The next bullet point, the citizens, democrats of Athens are those males over the age of 18, and they have got to be sons of Athenian fathers. This was after 451 BC. The mother as well had to be Athenian as well. So they number no more than 50,000, the whole of Attica. In addition to these citizens, the population includes about 25 metikoi, or known as foreigners, trading in Athens. But this is a major commercial centre. Together with 3 women and children and perhaps 100,000 slaves, this gives a total of about 300,000 people. So the voting citizens form at most 20% of the population. And the last bullet point, democracy is achieved in several stages through reforms linked with Solon. And I'll go and talk to you about who Solon was in 594, when the 10 tribes of Cleithins in 508 and with Pericles in 462.
Hi, sorry, Debbie. Back to the, yeah. When you were mentioning when you were talking about the first bullet point, you distinguish between the democracy that's formed today and what it was then. But either I missed, or could you elaborate on the distinction between the types of democracy?
Of democracy then?
Yeah, you said something.
Yeah, they experiment in direct democracy, which is unswerving democracy, as opposed to representative, which means typical democracy of modern societies today.
Yeah. So when you say unswerving and direct democracy, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that looks like in comparison to representative democracy.
Yeah, I've got to admit I haven't looked deeper into that, but I don't know if anybody else has any ideas of what that may be. I don't know if Emma's there or anybody else. Can I come? Yes, I was going to say I'll have to come back to you on that one. But if you,
I wasn't going to answer that one, but I was thinking about the role of women in society at that time.
Yes, exactly. Was there?
No.
Yeah, that's what I noticed, because it did bring out that males had to be over the 18, even though the mothers had to be of Athenian descent. It wasn't so much on them, even though they had to be as well. They weren't included in this.
Yeah. No, I was just looking at how the Greeks viewed women, and they basically saw them as the people that caused the mischievous and deceitful, and that they caused the downfall. In mythology, they caused the downfall of the men, and they had absolutely no rights. Women, they were there to bear children and look after the household, and they were controlled from birth to death practically by the men. That's what it seems.
And it's interesting how they had to be, even though they had this democracy, the women still had to be born in you know what I mean, in Athens. So you think if they've got nothing to do with it, why should that matter? You know what I mean?
What's that? If they've got anything? Yeah,
I was going to say, with the women had to be Athenian as well to be counted in.
Okay, yeah.
Democrats, even though they had nothing to do with it. It was interesting to me how they still had to be part of that that system in order for them to be counted as citizens.
Right, they weren't seen as citizens, it says here.
Yeah, no, they weren't included in the actual thing itself, if you see what I mean.
And the person who wrote this about the Greek women was saying it's ironic that it was seen as the birthplace of democracy when women were just not included at all.
Yes, exactly. So with the question that Curtis had, I didn't look deeper into what direct and typical of what the experiment in direct democracy was. I didn't look deeper into that, I'm afraid. So on your understanding, what would you say that was? Sorry, I didn't look deeper into that.
I don't have an understanding. So
No, I'm asking Emma. I'm asking Emma.
I don't know. Sorry, what was the other word? Direct democracy, and what was the other one?
I said experimenting direct democracy as opposed to the representative democracy of modern societies. So Curtis was asking, what's the difference between the two there?
Well, it says it's a form of government in which policies and laws are decided by a majority of all those eligible rather than by a body of elected representatives. So they decided the ones eligible are males over 18 who were born in Athens, presumably.
Yeah, and the represent, so that what's the typical democracy of modern societies where
Your vote.
Yes, exactly.
So
Deb-
America wouldn't be classed as a representative democracy, would it? Because elected officials, to a degree, still make the decisions for all. Yeah, I guess what is America? Okay, anyway.
Yeah, okay.
Debbie, is this the beginning of democracy, are you saying?
Yes, I want to look at how it first started.
So there was no democracy before the 5th century?
There could have been, but this is the only one that's written up. There could have been.
Oh,
No, if there's any other information that we can find, but this is the only one I could find. But if you can find anything getting up before this, CJ, I'd be glad. I'd be happy. Okay.
In answer to Curtis's question, I think it says that this differs from the majority of currently established democracies, which are representative democracies. They're not direct democracies.
Well, does that answer your question?
Because direct democracy or pure democracy is a form of democracy in which the electorate decides on policy initiatives without elected representatives as proxies. So that's kind of like the extreme position, is it, where all the people decide the law, not just the elected governors. So most countries, I don't know if every country does that, does it?
Yeah, remember they were just starting up then, Curtis, as well. Does that answer your question, Curtis?
To a degree, but I think I'll have to.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'll have to look deeper into it myself. But yeah, remember, we've got to still remember that they was just still starting out then. On to the next slide. So the previous slide, we're talking about somebody called Solon. So I wanted to look deeper into that. So Solon was an Athenian statesman, constitutional lawmaker and poet, yet Solon is credited with having laid the foundations for Athenian democracy. He is remembered particularly for his efforts to legislate against political, economic and moral decline in archaic Athens. His reforms failed in the short term, yet Solon is credited with having laid the foundations for Athenian democracy. So what did Solon do in 594? Solon was born into a noble family in 638 BC. He was a merchant by profession and a poet. In 594 BC, he was elected as archon, he was a kind of a governor in ancient Athens. That time, the society of Athens was facing an economic and moral depression due to an agricultural crisis. What were the three main parts of the democracy in Athens? The democratic government of Athens rested on three main institutions and a few others of lesser importance. The three pillars of democracy were the Assembly of the Demos, the Council of 500, and the People's Court. These were supplemented by the Council of the Areopagus and the Archons and the Generals. What caused Athens to become a democracy? Solon in 594 BC, Ephesians in 508 to 07 BC, and Ephiales in 462 BC contributed to the development of Athenian democracy. Cleithesians broke up the unlimited power of the nobility by organizing citizens into 10 groups based on where they lived rather than on their wealth. So what were the key characteristics of Athenian democracy? Athenian democracy refers to the system of democratic government used in Athens, Greece from the 5th century to the 4th century BC. Under this system, all male citizens, the demos, had equal political rights, freedom of speech, and the opportunity to participate directly in the political arena. What type of government did Solon have? Solon ended exclusive aristocratic control of the government, substituted a system of control by the wealthy, and introduced a new and more humane law code. Why is Solon the father of democracy? Solon laid the basis of democracy through eliminating debt slavery. He also probably established the Council of 400. Also, he gave every citizen the right to appeal the verdicts of magistrates before the assembly. Does anybody have any questions, or can we move on?
Yeah, Debs, I was just that last bit kind of stuck out to me. I don't know if anyone's able to look it up about I'm assuming that eliminating the debt slavery was that system of once you're born into a slave family,
Yeah.
you're a slave for life. Is that what it is? And
Yeah,
that
I'm going to come on to the next one.
okay.
I will explain it, but thank you for the question. Yeah, Sophie. It says, who were the two sons of Solon's reforms? What were the two sons? What were two of Solon's reforms? Under Solon's reforms, all debts were abolished and all debt slaves were freed. The status of the hectomai, the 1/6 workers who farmed in an early form of serfdom, was also abolished. These reforms were known as the I don't know how you pronounce it, Cavavia. Does that answer your question at all, Sophie?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it helps break it down.
Lovely, thank you. Next slide. Sophie, can you read the next slide for me?
What was that? You want 1/6 worker? That reminded me of like 2/3 of a person in America. Do you know what that means? In the previous one, the status of the hectomai, the 1/6 workers.
Yeah, I should imagine or maybe it's talking about the slaves itself. I don't know. I didn't look deeper into that either. Maybe it was to say maybe they were workers on the farm, but maybe, I don't know, some of them were slaves. I don't know if it's simple as that. But maybe that's something that we could look deeper into later as well. I don't know if anybody else has got any other ideas.
Yeah, Emma, I just looked it up, and it was basically the hectomai were dependent farmers who cultivated the land of the privileged on condition that they would yield 1/6, a six, I guess that's where they got their name from, of the produce instead of a rent. So I guess you're trapped in this system of you're not actually technically free. You're basically tied to having to work that land in order to live.
So you have to pay rent basically, or tax 1/6.
So you did, yeah. So by doing that, you wouldn't have to pay that rent, but you would have to work the land for a 6 of produce, I think.
Pay tax.
Yeah, this reminds me very much of what God does after 50 years or so. I can't remember how much it is. It very reminds me very much of what God did. Yeah.
And that's what kind of jumped to my mind as well. It's interesting that that's linked to democracy, that free of the slave.
Yeah, definitely.
Emma, maybe this will help. I'm just kind of like scanning through this page. And apparently the reason why it was so bad, Emma, is because these farmers would basically, they're working. And if you're a poor farmer, everything you kind of grow is just enough almost to feed your family and get everything done and kind of live a basic but free life. So if you're having to hand over a 6 of that, all your work of a year, it's almost you're always going to be in debt. If that makes sense.
Oh wow! Thank you very much for that, Sophie.
Yeah.
Yeah, very likely. Next slide. Sophie, can you read this for me on the screen, please? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. The move toward democracy reflects other changes in society. In the prehistoric period throughout Greece, aristocratic families have provided the main fighting force as cavalry. In the 7th century, the Green city-states developed the new military concept of the heavily armed infantrymen, the hoplite. A remorseless phalanx of hoplites became effective on the battlefield as a tank in modern times. The soldiers provide their own weapons and armor, but this is expensive. Several of the Greek oligarchs, including that of Athens in the 6th century, reflect the power of this middle class of citizens. The poorest citizens of a green state, unable to afford armor, can only plan their part in the army as light infantry, useful in a skirmish, but relatively unimportant on the battlefields of the day. A strategic change of direction by Athens early in the 5th century gave those poorer citizens a new power. The military effort is diverted into building up an Athenian navy, triremes. The fast warships of the time need men to row them. Suddenly, every citizen has a part to play, and the crews of a fleet of warships were self-evident political strength. A more radical democracy, introduced by Pericles in 462, is almost an inevitable result.
Thank you. And what do you get from that?
Yes, I think a kind of few things kind of jump to my mind, Debs. I think the first one is just by having the military part, like might, these wealthy families were able to have control, so democracy wasn't able to flourish. And kind of what came to my mind as I started to read that was the battle between the king in the north and the king in the south in our time, where Russia, a country that's built on oligarchs, the wealth keeps Putin in power. And then Ukraine, I'm not making an application, I'm just saying this is what it reminds me of. Ukraine, who's quite poor, you know, doesn't have the ability to fight against, to defend itself against the oppressor. So that kind of came to mind. That is something that takes away democracy. But then kind of Athens takes a bit of a change to give citizens power. Interestingly enough, it's men though. And that power comes with political strength. So now citizens, because they're, again, kind of like what we're seeing in Ukraine, once those who are a bit weaker, sorry about all this noise, the tourists just don't
That's
take
all
care
right.
of
I'm listening to you. No, I'm listening to you. It's okay.
Yes, as the citizens, the men are able to defend themselves, then they find they've got political strength as well. And by doing kind of leveling the playing field, it kind of takes democracy in a new kind of radical direction, I guess.
Yeah, amen. Thank you for that, Sophie. Well said. Go to the next one. Thank you. I'll read the next one. Emma, do you want to read the next one? That's what she's there.
The Athenian democracy, 5th century. Each has a voice. The Ecclesia or assembly meets 4 times a month. As many as 5,000 citizens attend. In 400 BC, pay was introduced. Citizens to answer the herald's question, who wishes to speak? They would address a large crowd in the open air. The debate is carried out by regular speakers. The leading politicians were known as rhetores, orators. Members were chosen by drawing lots. The council was known as the boule or council, which consisted of 500 members. 50 are selected at village level by each of the 10 tribes, which make up Athenian society. The reforms of Clisthenes in 508 have imposed those arbitrary tribal divisions in order to share out democratic power. Each member serves for a month. 50 prutenes or presidents run the everyday administration of the city. There are 10 months in the Athenian year. Each councillor has 1 monthly term of office. The chairman of the boule changes every day and is selected by a lot from the 50 prutenes. Every councillor is head of state for 1 day of the year.
Right, okay, so that's the mechanics of Athenian democracy. What do you understand from that, or similarities?
It's quite a lot in there.
Yes, there is. Yeah. Oh, little.
5,000 citizens attend. That's a lot.
It is.
A month. So is that weekly, really? We say weekly.
It's saying, well, it does it.
They meet 4 times a month, which is weekly.
It is weekly, yeah, it is weekly.
5,000 citizens attend. In 400 BC, pay was introduced. So they start to get paid to be in this government, I suppose. Citizens to answer the herald's question. So then anyone can speak in that group. The leading politicians were known as orators. Whether it was anyone, some of them spoke.
Yeah.
And then they drew lots. So it's a kind of about a voting system.
Yes, yeah. So it's all starting.
Votes are 500.
Yeah.
50 at village level by each of the 10 tribes. So there's 10 groups or counties, I suppose, tribes in Athens, and each one has 50 to represent them. So it's a bit like the states
Exactly, yeah.
but they have a certain number of people to represent the state. This is 10 for each. And that was so that the democracy would be, the power would be shared.
Yes.
But before that, just a few aristocratic people ran the place.
Ah, thank you very much. That's it.
Each member, I don't know about the last bit, each member serves for a month.
Yeah.
So they do that 4 times a month, they have a meeting, and then after those 4 times, they changed. Those 50 are changed, I suppose, every month, is it?
It says one councillor monthly term, yeah, every month, monthly term of office.
But that every councillor is head of state for 1 day of the year.
Ah,
So they take it in turns who's going to be the head of state.
yeah, exactly. This is a very in its early infancy, really, isn't it? So yeah, thank you for that, Emma. I'm just going to go on to the next slide. Even in law, an important area of each citizen's responsibility, there are no experts. Jurors are selected by lot, but a secondary lottery assigns each man to a particular case. Pericles introduces payment for jury service so that no citizen is excluded by poverty. Without professional judges or lawyers and with the huge juries, an Athenian court of law is rough and ready justice. Ostracism. In getting rid of the city of powerful and unpopular figures, ostracism was used in Athens from 487 to 417. They would go into exile for 10 years with no harm done to their family, his property, and his rights. 322 BC, democracy survives the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, only to come to an abrupt end a century later. After the death of Alexander the Great, the Athenians joined other Greek states in an unsuccessful revolt against Macedonian rule. The Macedonians retaliate in 322 by placing a garrison in Attica. An oligarchy is imposed, with the franchise restricted to the rich. Does anybody want to make a comment on that? If not, we'll move on.
So the oligarch has an opinion, can impose their kind of what they believe should happen.
Yes, they had a bit of
Because of their,
yeah. Thank you, Stephen.
isn't that very similar to what's happening in Russia too, with the oligarchs?
Exactly. This is the reason why, exactly, Suji, this is why I was looking at this and I could really see the similarities in how we're in our government today, even though it was in its infancy there. We could see very similar things taking place, can't we?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Right, we're going to go on to the Constitution. Everybody knows and should understand about the Constitution. So we know in 1776, Constitution of America was provided by God to the United States. So the United States was to be an example and light for other countries to follow, to show them what democracy should be, where there's be fair rights for all without the prejudice of ethnicity and the classes, etc. So God said if they were to be successful in that, America, they would be successful and prosperous. So there was a reason why God brought out the democracy through this Constitution. Sue, do you want to read this on the screen for me, please?
The rise in authoritarianism, or the authoritarianism. The contribution of the United States is the supreme law of the United States of America. It superseded the Articles of Confederation, the nation's first constitution in 1798. Originally comprising 7 articles, it delineates the national frame and constraints of government. Its first 3 articles embody the doctrine of the separation of powers, whereby the federal government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative, consisting of the bicameral Congress, Article 1, the executive, consisting of the president and subordinate officers, Article 2, and the judicial, consisting of the Supreme Court and other federal courts, Article 3. Article 4, Article 5, and Article 6 embody concepts of federalism. Oh, hang on. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
describing the rights and responsibilities of state governments. The states in relationship to the federal government and the shared process of constitutional amendment. Article 7 establishes the procedure subsequently used by the 13 states to ratify it. The Constitution of the United States is the oldest and longest standing written and codified national constitution in force in the world today. The supremacy clause of the Constitution of the United States, Article 6, Clause 2, establishes that the Constitution, federal laws made pursuant to it, and treaties made under its authority constitute the supreme law of the land, and thus take priority over any conflicting state laws. It provides that state courts are bound by and state constitutions subordinate to the supreme law.
Thank you very much. So basically, you can find this is talking about the Constitution, why it was made.
Yeah, America.
Yeah, exactly. What else do you get from that, Cedra? So we know, yeah.
It was really just explaining the first paragraph about the three branches, I think, of the Constitution. And then I don't understand. Oh, that's better. Wow. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution of the United States, Article 6, establishes the Constitution. Federal laws made pursuant to and treaties made on its authority constitute the
supreme law of the land.
The land, that's take priority over any conflicting state laws.
Hmm.
So that means that there was a clause made under that Constitution that would take a priority or precedence over any other conflicting state laws.
Exactly, and that's a very important point, that is, considering the title that we've got today. So it provides that state are bound by it and subordinate to the supreme law. So that supreme clause there is very, very important with regards to what's going on and what it's going to lead up to when we go later in the study. So thank you very much for that, Cedric. So since the Constitution was ratified in 1789, it has been amended 27 times. The first 10 amendments, known collectively as the Bill of Rights, offer specific protections of individual liberty and justice and place restrictions on the powers of the government within the United States. The majority of the 17 later amendments expand individual civil rights protections. Others address issues related to federal authority or modify government processes and procedures. Amendments to the United States Constitution, unlike ones made to many constitutions worldwide, are appended to the document. The original US Constitution was written on 5 pages of parchment. The first permanent constitution, it is interpreted, supplemented, and implemented by a large body of federal constitution law and has influenced the constitutions of other nations. So that's important, and has influenced the constitutions of other nations. So keep that in your mind. The constitutional provisions which the people have established for the security of their rights fail so completely to do what they have been appointed to do, and really subvert, undermine the Constitution instead of supporting it. That's quite right. Then the right to do themselves in their own proper persons rest by a double tenure with the people. First, it is always the right and just prerogative of the people to set the actions of these servants alongside of the Constitution and judge whether they have indeed supported it or failed to support it. These are little snippets that I picked up here. Remember the words of Dickinson quoted on page 144, that the people must restore things to that order from which their functionaries have departed. And of Wilson, that the supreme power resides in the people, and they never part with it. The words of Bryce, that the people censure any interpretation which palpably departs from the old lines. And the words of Lincoln, that the people of the United States are the rightful powers of both Congresses and courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Does anybody have any comments I want to make about those two things in particular? If not, we'll move on. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. And another of these, Jane Madison, sorry.
There was a lot of information on that previous slide. It's a bit.
Yes, exactly. That's what I said. I think these were little snippets that I thought were very good.
Yeah, if you go back to that one, I'm just trying to work out, because it said there about the amendments and how they're added to the original constitution. And then it compared that in the middle of that first paragraph. It said something about amendments to the United States Constitution, unlike ones made to many constitutions worldwide, are appended to the document. The original US Constitution was written on the page of parchment. I was trying to see how other nations do it, and I've only just started looking at that, so I don't know whether it seems like they reword the document because they add the amendment in and they reword it, whereas the United States leaves the original wording
and just
afterwards. Whereas people update their constitution, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I think the two nations who have done that, I've looked into Hungary and of course Bhutan. And so when they've amended it, that's their original constitution then, rather than the former. So is that, you see, can you say that as positive or negative? Because in some ways you could see that as positive. Well, the thing is, I mean, if you read, it says that we were supposed, did it say it in here, that we were supposed to be, America was supposed to be the leading, I can't remember what it said before, they were supposed to follow that exact template. And it's supposed to help other nations to follow that exact template, but they haven't, have they? They've taken parts of this template and they've added their own to it, haven't they? I suppose it's only positive if the amendment is a positive one. Yes, it is. And it is. So if you're going to rewrite the constitution and put something in there that it talks about the amendments to expand individual civil rights. So when you look at the other nations who have changed their constitution, they've actually done quite the opposite. They've actually restricted individual civil rights through this. When they're renewing their constitution, they're not expanding on people's civil rights; they're actually restricting it. Right. Okay.
A comment. I don't think you can compare the United States with other countries, as this document is simplistically saying.
Oh.
States is a federal system that has 50 states with it. And I don't think there's an equivalent model across the world. Most countries, in fact, I think all other countries, even Russia, is just a singular country. It doesn't have independent, autonomous states that come together and form a federation. The closest you got to that was the USSR, but even that was a dictatorship. It didn't really follow the American model. No. So the reason why you can't amend the Constitution is because the Constitution of the United States is a federal document, but the amendments aren't designed for federal power. They're designed to temper federal power, not bolster it. So the amendments are for state rights and for individual rights. You can't just go into the Constitution and change it that way. It's not designed that way to do that. That's why you have the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, and they were put into effect at the same time as the Constitution. So you can't have a Constitution and then put 10 amendments in it and publish them at the same time. It wouldn't really make sense if you had a simplistic model, as I guess is being inferred in this discussion, because you just rewrite the Constitution at the very beginning and include those 10 amendments in there. But the reason you don't is because they're simplistically diametrically opposed about whose rights they're protecting or they're pushing for. The Constitution is pushing for federal authority or federal rights, and the amendments are pushing for state and individual rights. They're in tension against one another. That's why you can't simply combine them. It's not as straightforward as this discussion is inferring that it is.
All right, okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that, Elder Belinda. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, we'll go on. So justice is the end of the government. It is the end of civil society. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly he said to reign as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. And another of these, James Madison, nobly said, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one we should not only be founded on free principles, but in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of magistracy as that no one could transcend their legal limits. And these are some other snippets I've put in. Says Chief Justice Marshall, the powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and those that limit those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten. The Constitution is written. To what purpose are powers limited, and to what purpose is that limitation committed to writing? If those limits may at any time be passed by those intended to be restrained, the Constitution either a superior paramount law, unchangeable by ordinary means, or it is on a level with ordinary legislative acts, and like any other acts is unalterable when the legislature shall please to alter it. If the former part of the alternative be true, then a legislative act contrary to the Constitution is not law. If the latter part is true, then written constitutions are absurd, attempts on the part of the people to limit a power in its own nature, illimitable. A statute passed by Congress beyond the scope of its powers is of no more effect than a bylaw made ultra vires by English municipality. If the subordinate bodies attempt to transcend the power committed to it and makes rules for other purposes or under other conditions than those specified by the superior authority, these rules are not law, but are null and void. Their validity depends on their being within the scope of the lawmaking power conferred by the superior authority, and as they have passed outside that scope, they are invalid. They ought not to be obeyed or in any way regarded by the citizens because they are not law. We're going to go and speak about look at some
Sorry, can you summarize that last slide?
Can I do what, sorry?
Can you summarize that last slide? Because I think there's a lot of information and probably it's just going over our heads.
What do you see from the first paragraph?
That's what I was asking you.
We're talking about the legislature. I know, but I want to ask you.
Well, it seems to be addressing the fact that the Constitution is there to limit and to define and limit the power of the legislature, the governing people. And then he's asking that question, why are these powers limited? And how it works, I suppose. And that they shouldn't be able to just go in and change and alter that according to how they please, because then it ceases to do what it's supposed to do, which is limit and define their power. So that then it's an unalterable kind of foundation that we always go back to. I wasn't sure about the last part. If the subordinate body attempts to transcend the power committed to it, so if that body then makes its own rules beyond the Constitution, I suppose he's saying in that context, they're null and void, because the validity of those rules has to be judged by the Constitution.
Yeah, because it said the Constitution is either a superior paramount law, unchangeable by ordinary means, or it is on a level with ordinary legislative acts.
So they're not law if they just come up with something that it's not in they're allowed to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Emma, for clarifying that for me. Thank you. I'm just going to move on to, I looked into E.G. White and what she thought about the Constitution, so I'm just going to read some comments by E.G. White. So in that grand old document, Constitution, which our forefathers set forth as the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees in the most explicit terms the viability of conscience. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The framers of the Constitution recognize the eternal principle that man's relation with his God is above human legislation, and his rights of conscience inalienable. Reasoning was not necessary to establish the truth. We are conscious of it in our own bosoms. It is this consciousness which, in defiance of human laws, has sustained so many martyrs in tortures and flames. They felt that their duty to God was superior to human enactments, and that man could exercise no authority over their consciences. It is an inborn principle which nothing can eradicate." Anybody want to comment on that? As the tidings spread through the countries of Europe, of a land where every man might enjoy the fruits of his own labour and obey the convictions of his own conscience, thousands flocked to the shores of the New World. Colonies rapidly multiplied. Massachusetts, by special law, offered free welcome and aid at the public cost to Christians of any nationality who might fly beyond the Atlantic to escape from wars or famine or the oppression of their persecutors. Thus, the fugitive and the downtrodden were by statute made the guests of the Commonwealth. The global decline in democracy has accelerated. When you look throughout the world today, you can see there is a decline in democracy. So what are the causes and what are the trends? There is a company that measures the level of democracies throughout the world and found...
Stop. I was just going back to that last one. Was that Ellen White, that last one?
Yes.
You made it all sound very nice, that, but when you read it, look at the details, it says to Christians of any nationality.
No, that's what stood out to me. I would change that word to anybody. It doesn't have to be Christians.
So it's not freedom of conscience when it comes to religion.
Yeah.
It's not doing it properly.
No.
But no, Rhode Island this is where Roger Williams, I don't know when she's writing this specifically, colonies rapidly multiplied.
Yeah.
So Massachusetts was fighting Rhode Island, I think. You see some of those states on the eastern seaboard, they were fighting Roger Williams. So he had to flee to Rhode Island, where he finally, established separation of church and state. There were still very Christians only, and even certain Christians.
Oh, right, okay.
She makes it look very
Nice.
because it depends what point she's trying to make, but she's trying to say it was the land of the free at that point, where they could escape this persecution, but it wasn't.
It was because of this going on. Okay, thank you, Emma.
Debbie, sorry, can you just slow down a bit? Because I think if you just, I don't know if people are following, as I'm certainly finding it quite hard to take in what's said and then understand it myself, and then you've moved on to the next one before everybody. I think
I'm giving an opportunity for people to speak up, but they're not, so that's why.
No, just read like 3 paragraphs of really heavy material, and people don't know what to say. I think if it.
Right, okay, all right. So what I'll do is I'll slow it down, as you said, Emma.
And then try and break it down, because it's a lot of information. If we don't break it down and just say, okay, so let's just summarize what that's saying, because it's quite hard to follow.
Okay, then we'll do. Okay, is it all right to move on now, Emma?
Yes, go to the next one. Sorry, I didn't get the next one.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to move on to the next slide, and what I'm hoping to do now is move on to obviously look deeper into why authoritarianism, the decline in democracy is taking place throughout the world. And I want to look at measurements and things like that, and we're going to go through particular leaders in particular that I thought were some very prominent in understanding why democracy is going down, and we can give some examples of that. So I'm going to read this next slide now. So the global decline in democracy has accelerated. When you look throughout the world today, you can see there is decline in democracy. So what are the causes and what are the trends? So this is what prompted me to do this study today. I wanted to understand what was causing the decline in democracy, and what were these causes, and what were the trends that was causing it. So this is what made me look deeper into it. So there is a company that measures the level of democracies throughout the world, and found that the annual gap between losses and gains widened in 2020, and fewer than a fifth of the world's people now live in fully free countries. So we are going to look at a chart next to establish how they've done that. We can see the trends if they're going up and down, and it's going to, as they measure the decline in democracy. Does anybody, is it all right to go to the next slide, or does anybody want to comment on this slide? Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Now, what I did was I wanted to know what the trends were, and I wanted to see how they measured it, and I wanted to see where the ups and downs were throughout history. So I found this chart, and there's different colors of it on there, as you can see. So the blue line is countries in autocratization episodes. That's democratic and autocratic regression. And also the orangey looking line is countries in democratization episodes. That's liberalization and democratic deepening. And also the dotted line is democratic countries under autocratization. So, and then I wanted to look at, and obviously it's got some dates on there. And so I wanted to do a chart to say, well, what was causing or the sort of decline in democracy, and what took place in certain pinpoints in certain years. So in the 1900s, 1900s is known as the post Cold War decade. So the 1900s are culturally imagined by many as the period from the revolutions of the 1989, which is here, and also until the global war on terror started around about this time, and which included the September 11 attacks, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also the dissolution of the Soviet Union that marked a retreat of Russian imperialism and the beginning of a multipolar world. So anti-Americanism remained in countries formerly occupied by the Soviet Union. So Russia at that time was in economic chaos due to the neoliberal free market reforms under advice of Western economics. So we can see, I wanted to pinpoint during certain times what was taking place. So that's the war on terror, the global war on terror, and all these sorts of things. At the end of the Cold War, Putin elected acting president. Twitter was launched. This is Viktor Orban. I don't know if people know or who understand who Viktor Orban was the president of Hungary. That's when he first came into power. And of course, we have Trump, the president of the USA. And then 2020, we have the January 6th insurrection. So these sorts of things are the cause of downtreading on democracy or declining democracy. Does anybody have any questions on this chart or the dates indeed, or do they want to comment?
So Debs, on the chart,
Yes.
The peaks are where authoritarianism is rising, yeah?
Declining is, where's declining is weakening.
Okay, where authoritarianism is weakening.
Yes.
Depends on
Okay.
No, democracy is weakening.
Democracy is okay.
Yeah.
And that kind of
that's on the
with,
sorry,
Could
comment.
I have one person talking at a time, please? Sorry. Go ahead, Sophie.
okay, yeah. So yeah, so then as democracy is falling, so I'm guessing the kind of axis on the going up is the number of millions of people maybe living under, or the percentage or number of people who might be living in that's it, number of countries living in
Yes.
a democratic system, and then these dates, these key events, all like line up with when we're seeing
Yes.
falls in. Okay, got you.
Yes, no, you got it. You got it. That's spot on. Thank you, Sophie. Emma, can you go ahead? Sorry.
Sorry, I'm just trying to differentiate between the blue and the orange line. So the orange line is democracies. So they rose heavily after the Second World War, and in the 1990s, there was a lot more democratic. Is that because the orange line is positive, isn't it? And the blue line is negative, as far as I'm looking, because that countries in
Not when the peaks are now.
regression.
The peaks are telling us it's not.
What's that?
I said the peaks are telling us it's not now.
No, the peaks of the orange are positive, but the peaks of the blue are not.
Right, okay.
I think because I'm looking at what the key is, and the key says the blue is countries that are democratic and autocratic regression. So they're in regression, the blue ones. The orange ones are democratization, liberalization, and democratic deepening. So that's positive.
Sorry, yeah.
And then the dashed blue line is countries under autocratization. So
Yeah.
they're already under regression, the blue one. So we see that the dashed blue one is negative.
Right.
The other blue one is
Better.
becoming more negative. No, sorry, that's better. No, the orange is good. And the other blue one is not that great. So the orange is positive, that it rises after the Second World War and the First World War, actually. You can democracy increases and holds its own pretty much. Well, it dips there in the 60s, and then it rises heavily in the 90s, and it's dropping right back down now from 2010. You can see from 2000, like you say, and then it's overtaken by the blue. So we've got more negative ones who are in autocratic regression than we have positive, the orange one, and the blue dashed one, which is pure dictatorship, it seems. I think autocratization is on the rise as well. So when the two blue lines are coming up and the orange is going down, it's a bad sign.
Right, okay then. Thank you very much, Emma. We'll move on. To help us understand what is happening in the world today, we will look at three particular countries to see and understand the trends, connectivity and parallels, but not necessarily related. We're going to look at three structural trends, post-Cold War, and what drove this. So part of it, what drove it, the three trends that I wanted to look at, or what I found out, what was driving this, was globalization, capitalism, and inequality. So the first was the excess of globalization, then the excess of capitalism, and the creation of exploding inequality happening at the same time that globalization is kind of encroaching on people's national identity or tribal identity. Does anybody want to comment on that? Does everybody understand what was said on there?
What does excess of globalization mean? So we can see like capitalism's on the rise, and they're saying that's negative.
Yeah. So, well, excess of it, well, what's globalization? What do you understand is globalization, Emma?
I'm not sure, because I was thinking that was just expansion of, in a positive sense.
Well, it should be, but I think that if it's not used in the sense that it's supposed to be used, what could happen?
Would that mean a rising sphere of influence of someone like Russia who's got more countries under his control?
Of course, yeah, of course. I mean, when you think of globalization and the financial markets, especially, when we look back in the past, we can see that global trade has caused the rise of many, world powers in history. And when I looked at that, I looked at Marco Polo and Columbus and all these things, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all these were to do with, expansion of it.
So is it companies doing businesses with other countries?
That's right. I mean, when we can look at who can we look at? China, especially 20th century China. Global trade made by China has made China into the power that it has today. I mean, everything that you buy made in China.
So the downside, go on.
Go on, Emma. That's the way I see it anyway.
The downside of that is someone like China, who's say a dictatorship government becomes more powerful and then is able to pull more strings because globalization, the definition is growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trading in goods and services and flow of people and information. So if you were more self-sufficient before, so say China was doing all its own thing for its own people, but now it's going to do it worldwide, it has more power over those countries too. And if you're more dependent on someone else to get your apples from, they can pull the shots. So there's more.
And that's what's happening to Russia, you see. So we can talk about Russia and the fact that they've used, which we've had evidence of, with him having the Nord Stream gas supplies. And he's used that against other nations, hasn't he? So it's when they sort of push it ahead and use it for their own, and can use it as a weapon to other nations, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, I was going to say
to oppress people. They use it to oppress people. But go on, Sophie.
Okay, mine's just a small point just on that. And I think it's the word that it's the excess of globalization, the excess of capitalism. I'm just reading the last bullet point, and I think what jumps out to me and what kind of Emma was bringing up, it's when it goes too far, like we're seeing with the energy crisis, the impact is, look, the cost of living crisis, because it's like any superpower has that control, and we were studying this at uni, and one of the things they were bringing out was just the impact it has on the environment.
Yeah.
When globalization is a good thing, it brings lots of good things. When it goes too far, the climate rapidly declines, and I think it's more the excess of it, Debbie, if I'm reading that last bit correctly, rather than globalization of itself. And it's interesting that it says excess of globalization, excess of capitalism, but then when it comes to inequality, that's just full stop, it's bad. Or no, there's no such thing as, or there's an excess of inequality. Some inequality is good. That one is just like just straight up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, does anybody else any questions on that? If not, we'll move swiftly on. So the next slide is going to be another chart, and the scores with those affected are authoritarian countries like Belarus, which you know, China and Venezuela, and weakening democracies like India and the United States. So this chart here is showing that the world has recently become less democratic, but how much less democratic has the world become? So this chart shows you that the world has fallen from all-time democratic highs to now. Look at the 2000s, and also even the 1990s, really, and the 1980s. Okay, so the clearest example of this is India. Since India is home to 1.4 billion people, its classification has a big impact on some global trends. So various data now classifies India as an electoral autocracy and a substantially autocratization in recent years. So this is going to help us to understand what's going on in the world today. Does anybody have any questions about this? No? So at the same time, we should not overstate the differences between the approaches either. All other approaches still identify democratic decline in India. The approaches also attempt to agree that metrics which look at people instead of countries see larger declines, because countries with large populations have tended to lose more democratic rights. And while the democratic decline has been substantial, it has been limited. The world is still much closer to an all-time democratic highs than to historical levels. So this clearly is the case for the 19th and 20th centuries, when democratic rights and democracies were nearly absent. But it also holds for large parts of the 20th century, when democratic rights were heavily concentrated in some parts of the world. We're going to look now, the next slide is going to be electoral democracy. And this is a chart that's showing us how democratic rights, people have by weighing a country's democracy score by its population. So calculated this way, people's democratic rights have decreased as well. Countries received a population weighted average score of 0.41 for electoral democracy in 2021. Okay, and this is down from an all-time high of 0.5 in 2012.
Debbie,
Yes.
have you looked at the religions behind the democratic countries or authoritarian or dictatorship countries too? You know, like in Afghanistan, there's more Muslims, so Islam.
No, I haven't. I've just
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't pinpointed specific countries. I mean, you can actually go onto these websites yourself and have a look, because what they do is they keep a record of all the countries, so you can see every country on there and see if it's a free country, democratic country, or in authoritarian country. You can see all these things. They've listed it all, so it's quite an informative package when you actually go onto their website. That's what I've read there. So in recent years, countries and people have fewer democratic rights. Looking at the number of democracies and the people living in them tells us about big changes worldwide. When countries become democracies or stop being liberal or electoral democracies altogether, but countries and their citizens may experience smaller changes in their democratic rights that falls short of changing the overall regime type. This is because the extent of democratic rights differs across democracies and non-democracies, but also within them. So such changes within regimes would not show up on the previous chart. So therefore, another way of looking at whether the world has recently become less democratic is to look at how democratic countries are treating democracy as a spectrum. Anybody want to comment on this, or can we move on? I think it's self-explanatory. So what we're going to be doing now is looking at some three particular leaders that I wanted to talk about. And one of them was Viktor Orban, who's the president of Hungary. The other one we are going to talk about is obviously Trump, and then we're going to talk about Xi Jinping of China. I've picked these three in particular. And so Viktor Orban was born in 31st of May 1963. He's a Hungarian politician who has served as Prime Minister of Hungary since 2010, previously holding the office from 1998 to 2002. He has presided over Fidesz since 1993 with a brief break between 2000 and 2003. He headed the reformist student movement, the Alliance of Young Democrats, the nascent Fidesz. Orban became nationally known after giving a speech in 1989, in which he openly demanded that Soviet troops leave the country. At the end of communism in Hungary in 1989 and the country's transition to multi-party democracy the following year, he was elected to the National Assembly and led Fidesz's parliamentary caucus until 1993. Under his leadership, Fidesz shifted away from its original centre-right, classical liberal, pro-European platform towards right-wing national populism. Orban's first term as Prime Minister from 1998 to 2002 at the head of Conservative coalition government was dominated by the economy and Hungary's entry into NATO. He served as leader of the opposition from 2002 to 2010. In 2010, Orban was again elected Prime Minister. Central issues during Orban's second premiership have included major constitutional and legislative reforms. In particular, the 2013 amendments to the Constitution of Hungary, as well as the European migrant crisis, the Lex CEU, and the COVID-19 pandemic in Hungary. He was re-elected in 2014, 18 and 22. On 24th of November 2020, he became the country's longest serving Prime Minister. he delivered a racist speech in Romania, which was for an hour and 15 minutes, criticising what he called race mixing in other European countries. There is a world in which European peoples are mixed together with those arriving from outside Europe. Now there is a mixed race world. And then there's our world, where people from within Europe mix with one another. Orban's comments sparked outcry, even from within his own government. One longtime aide resigned, describing Orban's remarks as a pure Nazi text worthy of gobbles. Budapest Chief Rabbi Zoltan Radner also criticised Orban's remarks. We cannot accept it in any way the kind of communications that includes talking about races, few races, and mixing of races. So Viktor Orban, as we can see, as we've just, is a dictator, and of course he's racist. So he's been in power for over about 15 years. 12 of them were consecutively since 2010. He delivered his speech, this particular speech here, when he was invited to CPAC. CPAC is Conservative Political Action Conference, which took place in Dallas, Texas, and Trump was the one who invited him to his golf club in Bedminster in New Jersey. So Trump invited this Orban to this conference, and of course it was no coincidence that Victor spoke about his racism in the speech, as he is well informed about Trump and his rhetoric, as white supremacists form a big part of Trump's base. As stated, he has been in power since 2010. He has been in power continuously since that time because he rigged the elections so no one else could win it. So his speech had anti-Semitism undertones, and in one of his campaigns, he was demonizing George Soros. He is the one who stood up against the wave of migration from Syria and Iraq and other places, making reference to an Islamic invasion of Europe. Does this sound familiar to you? It should do.
So Debs, was he first democratically elected? So he, goes through the normal voting process and elected, and then after he gets into power, that's when he kind of rigs things to always be in power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is how everybody else did it. So we're gonna see when I go through this, Sophie, we're gonna see some similarities here, right? And how this rhetoric and everything is all come together. They're all doing, even though they're not working together per se, we can see that they're doing very much the same thing. And this is why I picked these particular three in particular. So we're going to see this when I carry on with this presentation. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Deb.
Great.
Debbie, just to pick up that point about election, because that links with the previous slide where you talked about him being elected, but the previous slide before that, before you started talking about Viktor Orban, showed that in the rising countries that had elections. But I think the point or the comments that were made, or maybe it was the slide before that, was basically saying that this might not be a fair indicator because Hungary might be regarded as a democratic country because it has elections, but we know that they're rigged and it's not fair elections. So that's a skew in the figures depending on how they're measuring what democracy looks like.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you. So does anybody else want to make a point before I move on? I'm still going to be speaking about this president. So why do you think Trump would be interested in Orban? Why do you think it? So Orban represents for the American right a kind of irresistible combination of culture, war, issues. So now we see racism, white nationalism, but in the past he demonized also LGBTQ people. He's also rallied against gender studies and gender fluidity, where he rewrote the Constitution of Hungary, and he did that in 2011. He wrote that fetal life is protected from the moment of conception, so that you can see he has been on every single culture issue. And for the last dozen years, which has also been the program of the American right, Hungary is now a country that is in a dictatorship in which he has rigged election laws and almost all other laws. The American right sees in him is the use of culture wars as kind of a cover for creeping autocracy. And of course, The Republican Party are now right engaged in a campaign very much like Orban's in doing to rig the rules of the election by changing the laws in the United States, so that the Republicans are going to win no matter who wins the popular vote. So, which is the kind of thing Orban did in Hungary. Okay, so his political party is called Fetus, and it's associated European level with the European People's Party, which is the Christian Democratic Party in Europe that Angela Merkel's party was also involved in. So do you know who Angela Merkel is? Or do you remember who Angela Merkel was?
Yeah, isn't she from Germany?
That's
Chancellor
right.
something.
Amen. Thank you. That's it. And because Orban's party was in that Democratic European Party, those people, include Angela Merkel, have acquiesced in Orban's rise to power because they saw him in an ally. So this is a cover for him because he gave him protection in the EU, and other Christian democratic leaders thought he was one of them. So Orban, in a way, is just like Trump. He has support of the evangelicals and conservative Christians, and he's never set a foot in church. Okay, so that is about Orban. Does anybody have any questions about Orban, or can we move on? Right, we're going to go now on to Putin. And we know that Putin was born in October 1952 in Leningrad, it's Soviet Union, Russia. He's the youngest of 3 children. He was a Russian politician, a former intelligence KGB officer, serving current president of Russia. Putin has served continuously as president or prime minister since 1999, as prime minister from 1999 to 2000, and from 2008 to 2012, and a president from 2000 to 2008, and since 2012. So as we said, he's a KGB agent. He's worked there for 16 years doing that. He then rose to lieutenant colonel before resigning in 1991 to begin a political career in St. Petersburg. So he moved to Moscow in 1996 to join the administration of President Boris Yeltsin. He briefly served as a director of the Federal Security Service and Secretary of the Security Council of Russia before being appointed as Prime Minister in August 1999. After the resignation of Yeltsin, Putin became acting President of Russia, and less than 4 months later, he was elected outright to his first term as president. He was re-elected in 2004, and as he was constitutionally limited to 2 consecutive terms as president at the time. So Putin served as Prime Minister again from 2008 to 2012 under Dmitry Medvedev. He returned to the presidency in 2012 in an election marred by allegations of fraud and protest, and was re-elected in 2018. In April 2021, following a referendum, he signed into law constitutional amendments, including one that would allow him to run for re-election twice more, potentially extending his presidency to 2036, which we know won't take place. This is about Putin. We should know about Putin, but during his first tenure as president, the Russian economy grew on average by 7%, following economic reforms and a 5-fold increase in the price of oil and gas. Putin also led Russia during the war against Chechen separatists, re-establishing the federal control of the region. As prime minister under Medvedev, he oversees a war against Georgia, as well as military and police reform. During his 3rd term as president, Russia annexed Crimea and sponsored a war in eastern Ukraine, with several military incursions made, resulting in international sanctions and a financial crisis in Russia. He also ordered a military intervention in Syria to support Russian ally Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war, eventually securing a deal that granted permanent naval bases in the eastern Mediterranean. In 2017, Putin dispatched Russian PMCs to back the Touadera regime in the Central African Republic civil war, gaining a permanent military presence in return. During his 4th term as president, he presided over a military build-up on the border of Ukraine. And in February 2022, he launched a large-scale invasion, leading to international condemnation and expanded sanctions. The International Criminal Court opened an investigation into war crimes in Ukraine. In September 2022, Putin announced a partial mobilization and officially approved the forcible annexation of 4 Ukrainian blasts into Russia, an act which is illegal under international law. Under Putin's leadership, Putin has undergone democratic backsliding and a shift to authoritarianism. His rule has been characterized by endemic corruption, as well as numerous human rights violations, including the jailing and repression of political opponents, the intimidation and suppression of independent media in Russia, and a lack of free and fair elections. Putin's Russia has scored poorly on Transparent International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Putin is the 2nd longest currently serving European president after Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. So power in Russia's authority political system is concentrated in the hands of President Vladimir Putin. He's got loyal forces, subordinate judiciary, he's got control over media, legislative consisting of a ruling party and pliable opposition factions. The Kremlin is able to manipulate elections and suppress genuine dissent. So rampant corruption facilities, shifting links among state officials and organized crime groups. The Constitution establishes a strong presidency with the power to dismiss and appoint pending parliamentary confirmation the Prime Minister. The President is elected for as many as 2 consecutive 2 6-year terms. Constitutional amendments approved in 2020, allowed Putin, but not future presidents, to run for an additional 2 consecutive terms as president, potentially extending his rule to 2026, which is what we just read. As with past elections, President Putin's 2018 re-election campaign benefited from advantages including preferential media treatment, numerous abuses of incumbency and procedural irregularities during the vote count. His most influential rival, Alexei Navalny, was disqualified before the campaign began due to a politically motivated criminal conviction, creating what the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe called a lack of genuine competition. The funding sources for Putin's campaign were also notably opaque. So are the electoral laws and framework fair? Are they implemented impartially by the relevant election management bodies? Russia's electoral system is designed to maintain the dominance of United Russia. The authorities make frequent changes to electoral laws and the timing of elections in order to secure advantages for their preferred candidates. Opposition candidates have little chance of success in appealing these decisions or in securing a level playing field. In 2020, Putin signed a law permitting the use of electronic voting across Russia, raising concerns for the security and secrecy of ballots in the 2021 Duma polls and other future elections. Also that year, the president signed a law allowing a 3-day voting period in future elections. Critics argue that the expanded timeframe increased officials' ability to manipulate electoral outcomes. Do the people have the right to organize in different political parties or other competitive political groupings of their choice? And is the system free of undue obstacles to the rise and fall of these competing parties or groupings? The multi-party system is carefully managed by the Kremlin, which tolerates only superficial competition against the ruling party. A 2012 law liberalized party registration rules, allowing the creation of hundreds of new parties. However, none pose a significant political threat to the authorities, and many seem designed to encourage division and confusion among the opposition. The Justice Ministry has repeatedly refused to register Navalny's political party. In June 2021, Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, FBK, was declared an extremist organization, effectively preventing anyone associated with it from running for office. 3 new parties met a voting threshold in the 2020 local elections that will allow them to qualify for the 2021 Duma elections. New People for Truth and Green Alternative. In practice, each has links to the ruling party, allowing Kremlin-friendly political figures to distance themselves from the increasingly unpopular United Russia and siphon off voters who might otherwise support genuine opposition parties. Russia has never experienced a democratic transfer of power between rival groups. Putin, the Prime Minister, initially received the presidency on an acting basis from the retiring Boris Yeltsin at the end of 1999. He served 2 4-year presidential terms from 2000 to 2008, then remained the de facto paramount leader while working as Prime Minister until he returned to the presidency in 2012, violating the spirit, if not the letter of the Constitution's 2-term limit. A 2008 constitutional amendment extended presidential terms to 6 years, and a 2020 amendment allowed Putin to run for additional 2 terms, meaning he could remain in office but until 2036. Opposition politicians and activists are frequently targeted with fabricated criminal cases and other forms of administrative harassment designed to prevent their participation in the political process. Navalny was poisoned with a toxic nerve agent in August 2020 while he was investigating corruption and campaigning in Siberia, with evidence later emerging that the attack was carried out by the Federal Security Service, FSB. He had to be evacuated to Germany to prevent the authorities from interfering with his treatment, and he was arrested upon his return in January 2021 for violating probation, receiving a prison term in February. Legislation enacted in June 2021 banned individuals associated with extremist organizations from running for election. The Central Election Commission subsequently disqualified a number of candidates who were accused of extremism or association with undesirable organizations. Other opposition activists were sentenced to prison or fled the country due to charges they said were politically motivated. Among other new restrictions, Russian citizens who hold a second citizenship or a foreign resident permit, and people who have been found guilty of 1 of 400 criminal and administrative offences were unable to run for office as of 2021. In June, Golos reported that around 9 million Russians, or nearly 1 in 10 adults, had effectively been denied the right to run for public office. So as you can see, it was quite a detailed information, but we can see the corruption with how Putin was running the country. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next person? We're going to go on now to, we're going to go on now to Donald Trump, and we all should know who Donald Trump is. So Donald Trump was born in June the 14th, 1946. He's an American politician, media personality, and businessman who served as the 45th president of the United States from 2017 to 2021. Trump graduated from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's degree in 1968. He became president of his father's real estate business in 1971 and renamed it the Trump Organization. He expanded the company's operations to building and renovating skyscrapers, hotels, casinos, and golf courses, and later started side ventures, mostly by licensing his name. From 2004 to 2015, he co-produced and hosted the reality television series The Apprentice. Trump and his businesses have been involved in more than 4,000 state and federal legal actions, including 6 bankruptcies. So when we look at Trump now, Trump's political positions have been described as populist, protectionist, isolationist, and nationalist. He won the 2016 United States presidential election as a Republican nominee against Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton, despite losing the national popular vote. He became the first US president with no prior military or government service. His elections and policies sparked numerous protests. The 2000 and 2019 Special Counsel investigation led by Robert Mueller established that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to favor the election of Trump. Trump promoted conspiracy theories and made many false and misleading statements during his campaigns and presidency, to a degree unprecedented in American politics. Many of his comments and actions are being characterized as racially charged or racist, and many as misogynist. Trump ordered a travel ban on citizens from several Muslim majority countries, diverted military funding towards building a wall on the US-Mexican border, and implemented a policy of family separations for apprehended migrants. He rolled back more than 100 environmental policies and regulations in an aggressive attempt to weaken environmental protections. Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which cut taxes for individuals and businesses and rescinded individual health insurance mandate penalty of the Affordable Care Act. He appointed 54 federal appellate judges and 3 United States Supreme Court justices. Trump initiated a trade war with China and withdrew the US from the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, the Paris Agreement on climate change, which is interesting, and the Iran nuclear deal. So Trump met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un 3 times, made no progress on denuclearization. He reacted slowly to the COVID-19 pandemic, ignored or contradicted many recommendations from health officials in his messaging, and promoted misinformation upon unproven treatments and the need for testing. Many of Trump's comments and actions have been considered racist. In national polling, about half of respondents said that Trump is racist. A greater proportion believe that he has emboldened racists. Several studies and surveys found that racist attitudes fueled Trump's political ascent and were more important than economic factors in determining the allegiance of Trump voters. Racist and Islamic phobic attitudes are a strong indicator of support for Trump. Trump relaunched his political career in 2011 as a leading proponent of birther conspiracy theories, alleging that Barack Obama, the first Black US president, was not born in the United States. In April 2011, Trump claimed credit for pressuring the White House to publish the long-form birth certificate, which he considered fraudulent, and later saying this made him very popular. In September 2016, amid pressure, he acknowledged that Obama was born in the US and falsely claimed the rumors had been started by Hillary Clinton during her 2008 presidential campaign. In 2017, he reportedly still expressed birther views in private. Trump's Facebook and Instagram accounts have been reinstated by Meta, and we all know about the January 6th insurrection and what Trump was trying to get by force that he couldn't get fairly. The United States experienced further democratic decline during the final year of the Trump presidency. The US score had dropped by 11 points over the past decade and fell by 3 points in 2020 alone. The changes have moved the country out of a cohort that included other leading democracies, such as France and Germany, and brought it into the company of states with weaker democratic institutions, such as Romania and Panama. So what contributed to these scores, especially in 2020? The Trump administration undermined government transparency by dismissing and punishing and firing whistleblowers and attempting to control or manipulate information on COVID-19. There were mass protests, violence, police brutality, and brutal confrontations. So journalists were physically assaulted and arrested because they had covered these protests. And of course, we know of the shocking attempts against his election loss at the Capitol Hill building in January 2021. This put electoral institutions under severe pressure. It further damaged the United States' credibility abroad and underscored the menace of political polarization and extremism in the country. Would anybody like to talk about that part? That slide. We're now going on to the third person who I've chosen, and that's Xi Jinping, who's a Chinese politician, and he's currently the president of China. So Xi Jinping is a Chinese politician who has served as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and thus at the paramount leader of China since 2012. Xi has also served as the President of the People's Republic of China since 2013. Xi's status became more assured in March 2008. He was elected Vice President of China. In that role, he focused on conservation efforts and on improving international relations. In October 2010, Xi was named Vice Chairman of the powerful Central Military Commission and generally considered a major stepping stone to the presidency. In November 2012, during the CCP's 18th Party Congress, Xi was again elected to the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau, reduced to 7 members. Does anybody want to read the next slide? I've been doing a lot of reading at the moment. Deidre or Sophie, would you like to read the next slide? I don't know who else is out there.
There's Brian, Susan, Samoy, Leon.
Right, okay. Leon, would you like to do the next one? That's if you can. If not, I'll go on.
Debs, I'll read it.
Thank you.
Xi managed to consolidate power at a rapid pace during his first term as China's president. The success of his anti-corruption campaign continued, with more than 1 million corrupt officials being punished by late 2017. The campaign also served to remove any of Xi's political rivals, further bolstering his efforts to eliminate dissent and strengthen his grip on power. In October 2006, the CCP bestowed upon him the title of core leader, which previously had been given only to influential party figures Mao Zedong, Jiang Jinping, and Xi Jinping. The title immediately raised his stature. A year later, the CCP voted to enshrine Xi's name and ideology, described as thought. Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in a new era. In the party's constitution, an honor previously awarded only to Mao, Xi's ideology was later enshrined in the country's constitution by an amendment passed by the National People's Congress in March 2018. During the same legislative session, the NPC also passed other amendments to the constitution, including one that abolished term limits for the country's president and vice president. This change would allow Xi to remain in office beyond 2023, when he would have been due to step down. The NPC also unanimously elected Xi to a second term as president of the country in March.
Thank you very much. So throughout the year, the government pushed ahead with repressive programs aimed at changing demographics and ensuring social stability in ethnic minority areas, particularly Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia. New evidence indicated the massive scale of projects involved the forced relocation of rural residents, the forced sterilization of, I don't know how you pronounce this, Uighur, is it Uighur women, and the mass detention of Uyghurs in political re-education centers, and the imprisonment of tens of thousands of others by the courts. Credible reports of abuse and deaths in custody also emerged during the year. In August, ethnic Mongolian students, parents, teachers, and administrators mounted strikes and demonstrations to protest a required reduction in the use of Mongolian as the language of instruction in the Inner Mongolian region. The government responded with mass arrests, enforced disappearances, determination of employment, expulsion of students, property confiscations, and the threat of long prison terms. The authorities used various forms of harassment and coercion to pressure parents to send their children back to school. The authorities continued a year-long crackdown on independent civil society, with new arrests and criminal prosecutions of journalists and activists, as well as onerous scrutiny of foreign non-governmental organizations. Authorities also increased restrictions on religious practice by Chinese Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims. Throughout China, under 2018 regulations on religious affairs and persecution of the banned spiritual movement Falun Gong continued unabated. Right, okay. Right, the space for independent academic discussion and research reached new lows, with professors and students facing reprisals in the form of censored writings, travel restrictions, demotions, arrests, or imprisonment for expressing views that were deemed critical of CCP governance. So in summary, when we look at the 9/11 scrutinization of the American superpower, especially when they turned their national purpose into this war on terror, not only did they militarize their engagement with the world, which was bad for democracy, but they provided a template and a justification for autocrats to take for their own purposes. It doesn't mean, however, that America is responsible for what other countries do in copying their template, but it means that when you see Viktor Orban build a wall to keep out Muslims, when Vladimir Putin cancels the election of governors after the 2004 Beslan attacks, citing a war on terror, when Xi Jinping says it's a people's war on terror, it puts Uyghurs in concentration camps. So what are they using? They are using a structure that the USA provided in the first instance. It was these things that took place that led to xenophobia, which led to Trump in that way. So is America responsible?
Yes.
Yes, is the answer. So authoritarian powers, especially China, are advancing their interests around the world, while democracies have been divided and consumed by internal problems. So we now, by looking at this, we can see that the three people I chose there have very similar rhetorics, and the way that they're doing things very similar. And it's on this onward path. We know that Russia is already authoritarian dictatorship, China is, and we know that it's only going to be a matter of time that America will be authoritarianism and on that path to authoritarianism soon. And so the overall trajectory of social globally is still moving in that wrong direction. So we know that from all this information that I provided today, we can see that the weakening of democracy leads on to that. So, and we have these various leaders who are taking advantage of that. They're very corrupt leaders. They're all sort of changing the constitutions so that they can remain in power, and then they are oppressing the peoples. And we can see this in 3 different instances. So we can see by these things that America now is going to, by using almost the same sort of thing, is going to be moving on to authoritarianism, and obviously they're going to be doing the same thing, restricting people's rights. And we know that's not just that's sort of just around the corner and a not too distant future. So does anybody have any questions about the rise in authoritarianism, or perhaps they feel that something could be added to it, or is there any other questions? Does anybody have any questions whatsoever?
Not so much a question, Deb, more that my mind is lingering on this thought, like basically go right back to the beginning when we started off in ancient Greece. So Soren, I think it was Soren, I can't remember.
So long.
That's when they mark in time the beginning of democracy as we kind of know it now. Okay, and the reason I'm more speaking out loud more than anything is it's interesting that school, it's this idea of ideologies, because you have in contemporary kind of like philosophy and all the things that we hear from like right up to our time, like Marxist, and it's all based on a Greek understanding of Greek values, I guess, or Greek ideologies. So it's interesting that, especially with the last reading that we went through, that it kind of brings up this idea of ideology. And I think Emma kind of brought that out when it's that point that it's how they view democracy, and how, as an ideology, do they uphold it? Do they not uphold it? Do they use it for their own gain? Or like the Sauron in Greece, is it to free people, make people equal, or is it to actually you're going to twist democracy for your own gain?
Exactly. As you can see from these three men, they've almost mirrored the things that they're doing. It's almost like looking at a mirror. And what they've done is they've got into power and they've used it for their own. It's only when they get into power or more power that the more extreme they seem to become. And we can see that with those three people. That's if Trump gets in, but we can see it through the two in particular, and the type of extreme things that they were doing. And so that's what I saw, and that's what I thought, gosh, I wanted to understand deeper what is happening, what's the similarities between some of these leaders, and what are they doing. And we can see all this, and this is the rising authority when they take it about, and when they get into this stage, or authoritarianism stage, that's when all these rights are taken off and they start oppressing other people. And we can see when they get to that stage, it's more extreme. And so, because I've looked at something, another paper here, it says, and polarization both within and between countries to continue to grow, the weakening of multilateralism and the international legal order, and of international law itself, with immense consequences on human rights. Democracy veiling. So in 2021, the level of democracy enjoyed globally by the average person was down to 1989 levels. This means that democratic gains of the last 30 years have been greatly reduced. So last year, almost a third of the global population lived under authoritarian rule. And the number of countries leaning to authoritarianism is 3 times that of those leaning to democracy. You see where we are?
And I think once America goes down that way, then a lot of countries will follow.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think, sorry, Deb, it was just, it's going to sound like word vomit, but it's just what's going on in my mind.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it was a very fleeting point right at the beginning, which was made about how it's a cultural thing. So even though in modern world history, we see Greece as this first kind of, I guess, democracy or world, government.
Yeah.
Let's just say world government. I think that's the bit where you mentioned that they believed that women were kind of not to be trusted, and it just kind of took my mind anyway back to the Garden of Eden, and where this sin of inequality, where this sin of inequality kind of started. I know I'm not really making sense. And it's just this link between, and this is an unfinished thought, it's still going on in my mind. This thought between sexism and the fall of democracy, and how we view women as to our view on giving all people equal rights. Do we change the constitution to give all people equal rights? And I think it was interesting that it links it back to a culture before, so the kind of kingdoms before Greece, this same thread of culture, thread of inequality, kind of like woven through. But yeah, I'm word vomited now, so I'm gonna stop.
But that's okay. I'm just Thank you very much, Sophie. So we know, therefore, that the United States is definitely leaning towards authoritarianism, which will cause their destruction. As E.G. White states, national apostasy will cause national ruin. This is when their cup will be full. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Does anybody else want to comment before we end the presentation today? Yeah, okay. Okay, so we kneel for a word of prayer. Dear Holy God, we thank you so much for the time that we can spend with you in songs and worship, and also thank you for being there with the presentation today. I've certainly taken on board the people that have commented on the presentation, and there's lots of things I still need to learn, Lord, and I thank you for giving me that time to be able to do that. And it's also helped me to understand what's going on in the world as well, but I still need to ask more questions. And so I thank everybody that participated in this today. So please dismiss us now, Lord, as we end our Sabbath school, that we can continue to study and continue to spend time with you. So we thank you, Lord, as we give you thanks and praise in and through our beloved Saviour, always to your great honor and glory. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you. Okay, what we'll do, we're going to go on to testimonies and prayer requests. So on that, does anybody have any testimonies that people want to share with us today? Any testimonies? How did the Lord bless you? And can somebody stop the recording, please?